Everyone knew the single most important rule of the Grand Alpha Summit. Never look King Magnus in the eye. He was the Steel Wolf, a force in a three-piece suit who ended wars with a single snarl and ruled the Northern Territories with absolute authority. Elena was nobody, just an invisible Omega servant trying to survive the night without being noticed. But when she found the terrifying king asleep in the VIP lounge, she made a fatal mistake. She let her guard down. She whispered a secret thought to the empty air, believing she was safe. She wasn't. The lock clicked. The beast woke up. And now the most dangerous predator in the world isn't letting her leave until she repeats what she just said. The Grand Alpha Summit was a cacophony of clinking crystal, dominant roars, and the heavy scent of too much power confined in one ballroom. For Elena, however, it was just another night of trying to disappear into the wallpaper. As an Omega servant, her survival depended on two things: silence and invisibility. Her feet ached in her worn shoes as she balanced a tray of empty champagne flutes, navigating the sea of tuxedo-clad predators. She needed a moment of peace before the head housekeeper barked another order. She slipped toward the heavy mahogany doors of the VIP lounge, a restricted area reserved for the highest-ranking alphas. It was supposed to be empty at this hour. Elena pushed the door open just enough to slide inside, sighing as the muffled roar of the party faded. The room smelled of aged leather, cigar smoke, and something darker. Like a forest just before a storm. She moved to collect the discarded tumblers when a heavy, rhythmic sound made her freeze. Someone was sleeping on the leather sofa in the corner. Elena's heart hammered as she squinted through the dim light. It was him. King Magnus, the Steel Wolf, the man whose reputation was whispered in terrified tones across every packland. He was massive, even in sleep, his broad shoulders stretching the fabric of his dark suit. One large hand rested on his stomach, while the other hung loosely off the edge of the sofa. He looked peaceful, which was a terrifying contrast to the violence everyone knew he was capable of unleashing. She should have left immediately. That was the smart thing to do. But Elena found herself rooted to the spot, captivated by the rare sight of the monster at rest. Without the terrifying intensity of his golden glare, his features were strikingly sharp, almost noble. His dark hair fell over his forehead, softening the strong edge of his jawline. For a moment he didn't look like the tyrant who crushed rebellions. He looked like a man. A dangerously beautiful man. Elena took a step closer, her curiosity overriding her survival instinct. The air around him crackled with latent power. In the safety of the silence, thinking he was deep in slumber, she let the thought slip out. Her voice was barely a breath, soft and trembling. "It's a shame. The devil is so handsome." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Elena turned to leave, her heart racing at her own boldness, but a sound stopped her cold. It was the sharp intake of breath. She froze, her eyes widening as she looked back at the sofa. King Magnus was no longer sleeping. His eyes were wide open, glowing with a predatory molten gold light that pierced through the shadows and pinned her to the rug. There was no grogginess in his gaze, only terrifying, razor-sharp focus. He rose from the sofa with fluid, supernatural grace, unfolding his height until he towered over the room. Elena couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. She watched in paralyzed horror as he didn't lunge for her, but instead walked calmly, deliberately, past her. He moved to the mahogany door she had just entered through. With a click that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room, he turned the brass lock, sealing them inside. Then he turned slowly to face her, a low rumble, starting deep in his chest. The click of the lock reverberated through the room, sounding final and absolute. Elena pressed her back against the nearest wall, her pulse hammering in her throat like a trapped bird. King Magnus did not rush. He did not need to. He moved with the terrifying confidence of a predator that had already cornered its prey. He stepped into her personal space, a wall of muscle and heat that blocked out the dim light, effectively erasing the rest of the world. Magnus leaned down, his face inches from hers. Up close, he was even more devastatingly handsome. But it was a terrifying beauty, sharp as cut glass. He didn't speak. Instead, he inhaled deeply. The sound was ragged and primal, his nostrils flaring as he took in her scent. To Elena, she smelled like dish soap and cheap detergent. But to the Alpha King, she smelled like something else entirely. She saw his pupils dilate, swallowing the gold of his irises until his eyes were nearly black pools. His hand slammed against the wall beside her head, trapping her completely. "Say it again," he commanded, his voice a low gravel that vibrated in her chest. It wasn't a request. It was an order given by a man who had never been denied anything in his life. Elena trembled, shaking her head slightly, too terrified to speak. Then his other hand came up, not to strike, but to graze the sensitive skin of her neck. The touch was electric. A jolt of pure heat shot through her, and she gasped. That small sound seemed to snap the last thread of Magnus's control. The beast inside him, the ancient wolf that had been cold and dormant for decades, roared to life with violence that demanded release. He didn't just realize she was his mate. He felt it in every fiber of his being. The connection was instant, overwhelming, and absolute. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling sharply, and then he pulled back and let out a roar that shattered the crystal vase on the side table. "Mine." The word wasn't spoken. It was torn from his throat. A declaration that shook the very foundations of the room. Almost immediately, the heavy handle of the door jiggled violently. Fists pounded against the mahogany. "Your Majesty, King Magnus, is everything all right?" Magnus didn't move away from her. He kept his body pressed against hers, shielding her from the door, his eyes locked on her face. He turned his head slightly toward the door and let out a low, warning growl that vibrated through the wood. A sound so lethal that the pounding stopped instantly. No one dared enter a room where the steel wolf was claiming his territory. He looked back at Elena, his expression fierce and unyielding. "You are not a servant anymore," he growled, his thumb tracing her lower lip. "You are mine." The silence on the other side of the door was deafening. Elena knew that beyond the heavy wood, dozens of the most powerful shifters in the world were waiting, listening, judging. She looked down at her uniform, a simple, fraying black dress with a white apron that marked her as the lowest of the low. Panic flared in her chest. If she walked out there like this, they would tear her apart with their eyes. She tried to pull away, her hands pushing against his chest. "I can't go out there," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please, Your Majesty, look at me. I'm nothing. They will laugh at you." Magnus looked at her, really looked at her for the first time, seeing the shame etched into her features. His expression darkened, not with anger at her, but with fury at a world that had made her feel so small. He reached up and unbuttoned his suit jacket, shrugging the heavy, expensive fabric off his broad shoulders. Without a word, he draped it over her. The jacket was enormous on her small frame, falling to her mid-thighs, and hiding the servant's uniform from view. It smelled of expensive cologne, cedarwood, and the potent, earthy scent of Alpha. "Let them laugh," Magnus said, his voice deadly calm as he buttoned the jacket under her chin. "And I will tear their throats out." He didn't wait for her permission. He wrapped a possessive arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his side, and unlocked the door. He kicked it open, revealing the corridor and the entrance to the grand ballroom. The transition was jarring. The bright lights assaulted Elena's eyes, and the sudden hush that fell over the crowd was suffocating. Every head turned. Every conversation died. They walked into the ballroom, the Alpha King and the servant girl hidden beneath his coat. The contrast was stark and shocking. Magnus walked with his head high, his gaze daring anyone to speak, his presence dominating the enormous space. Elena kept her eyes on the floor, focusing on the movement of his polished shoes, trying to breathe through the waves of hostility rolling off the crowd. She could feel their stares like physical blows, confusion, disgust, envy. But Magnus did not rush. He paraded her through the center of the room, cutting a path through the dignitaries. When a high-ranking alpha from the southern pack stepped forward, Magnus let out a low, rumbling snarl that stopped the man in his tracks. The message was clear. Do not approach. Do not look. Do not breathe in her direction. Elena felt the vibration of his growl through his chest, a terrifying sound that was somehow comforting because it was directed at the world, not her. He was a monster, yes, but for the first time in her life, the monster was on her side. They reached the grand exit, and the cool night air hit her face, but the heat of his arm around her waist never wavered. The limousine was a sleek, armored fortress that glided through the city streets. Inside, the silence was thick and heavy. Elena sat as far away from Magnus as the leather seat would allow, clutching the lapels of his jacket tightly. The reality of what had just happened was crashing down on her. "You have to let me go," Elena said, breaking the silence. Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to look at him. "You don't know who I am. I have no bloodline. My parents were rogues. I have no wolf spirit to speak of. I can't even shift properly. I am the lowest rank there is." She spilled the secrets she usually guarded with her life, desperate to make him see reason. "You are a king. You need a Luna who is strong, someone with power. If you take me, you will be weak. They will use me against you." Magnus moved before she could blink. One moment he was on the other side of the car, and the next he was looming over her, crowding her into the corner of the seat. He didn't touch her, but his presence was overwhelming. "Weak," he repeated, the word rolling off his tongue with disdain. "You think I am so fragile that a maid of lower status will crumble my kingdom? You insult me, little one." He reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering on her cheek. "I do not need a political alliance. I have armies for that. I do not need a warrior. I have killers for that. I need you." Elena stared at him, stunned by the intensity of his conviction. "No more," he ordered softly. "You doubt yourself because you have been told you are nothing. I will spend the rest of my life showing you that they were wrong." He pulled back and pressed a button on the intercom. "Garrett," he barked, addressing his beta. "Prepare the jet. We leave for the Steel Kingdom tonight. Notify the palace that I am returning with my mate." The finality in his voice terrified her. The Steel Kingdom was a frozen territory in the north, thousands of miles away from everything she had ever known. But as she looked at Magnus, who had settled back into his seat but kept one hand resting protectively on her knee, she realized that part of her, the deep, instinctual part buried under years of fear, didn't want to run. She was terrified of the future, yes, but for the first time, she wasn't invisible. The tarmac was windswept and cold. The private jet waited like a sleeping steel bird under the glare of floodlights. Elena shivered, not just from the wind that whipped around her bare legs, but from the sheer scale of Magnus's wealth and power. Magnus guided her out of the car, his hand firm on the small of her back. But before they could reach the stairs, a sharp, melodic voice cut through the noise. "Magnus, surely this is a joke." Magnus stiffened beside her, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Elena looked up to see a woman stepping out from the shadows near the hangar. She was breathtakingly beautiful, with cascading silver blonde hair, porcelain skin, and a red dress that cost more than Elena would earn in 10 lifetimes. It was Lady Vivian, the daughter of the Southern Alpha, a woman who had been publicly campaigning to be Magnus's mate for years. She looked at Elena with a mixture of amusement and utter revulsion. "You can't be serious," Vivian laughed, though the sound was brittle. She walked closer, ignoring the guards. "You're dragging a servant onto the royal jet. What is she? A pet? Really, Magnus?" She wrinkled her perfect nose. "She smells like floor cleaner and desperation. Send the little rat back to the kitchens where she belongs. Elena shrank back, the insults stinging because they echoed her own insecurities. But Magnus's grip on her waist tightened. He didn't look at Vivian. He looked at the space above her head, dismissing her existence entirely. Garrett, he said calmly, though the underlying threat was unmistakable. Remove this obstacle from my path. Vivian gasped, her face flushing red. You can't dismiss me. I am a High Alpha's daughter. You are choosing trash over me. Magnus stopped moving. He slowly turned his head to look Vivian in the eye. The air temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Careful, he whispered, his voice carrying effortlessly over the wind. You are speaking to your future queen. The only reason you are still breathing is because I do not wish to upset her with the sight of violence on our first night. He stepped closer, towering over the terrified woman. She is not trash. She is the Luna of the Steel Kingdom. And if you ever disrespect her again, I will forget about treaties, and I will wipe your father's pack off the map. He didn't wait for a response. He swept Elena up into his arms, carrying her past the stunned Vivian. Elena buried her face in his neck, overwhelmed by his defense of her. As the cabin door hissed shut, sealing them in, Elena realized there was no going back. The war had begun, and she was right in the center of it. The cabin of the private jet was silent luxury. For Elena, however, it felt less like a sanctuary and more like a high-altitude interrogation room. She sat rigid in the plush chair, her hands still clutching the lapels of Magnus's jacket. Across the narrow aisle, Magnus watched her. He hadn't looked away since takeoff. The silence stretched until it was almost painful. Her stomach gave a treacherous, loud rumble that shattered the quiet. She flushed crimson, mortified. Magnus's lips twitched. He reached out and pressed the call button. A flight attendant appeared instantly, her eyes darting nervously toward the king. Food, Magnus commanded simply. Meat, and bring everything else you have. Minutes later, a feast was laid out. There were platters of fruits, cheeses, warm bread, and a massive steak. Magnus cut a large piece and held it out to her. He wasn't going to let her feed herself. It was a primal display, the alpha providing for his mate. Elena hesitated. To accept food from an alpha's hand was an act of submission, a deep acknowledgement of the bond. If she ate this, there was no going back. She looked into his eyes and saw the raw need burning there. Slowly, she leaned forward and took the bite. The flavor exploded on her tongue. Magnus let out a low, satisfied rumble that vibrated through the seat. He fed her piece after piece, ignoring his own hunger until she was full and sleepy. The moment the jet door opened, the cold hit Elena like a physical blow. It was a dry, biting freeze that instantly numbed her exposed skin. The Steel Kingdom was not merely cold. It was hostile. Before her foot could touch the frozen stairs, Magnus scooped her up into his arms effortlessly, shielding her body with his own massive bulk. The North does not forgive weakness, he murmured against her hair. He carried her toward a waiting convoy of black SUVs. But beyond the vehicles, a crowd had gathered. The pack. Hundreds stood in perfect formation. They had come to see the king return, and more importantly, to see the mate he had claimed. Elena peeked out from the collar of the jacket, and she saw the confusion ripple through the ranks. They were expecting a warrior queen. Instead, they saw a trembling girl buried in a coat 5 sizes too big. She saw the looks exchanged between the warriors, the furrowed brows. Disappointment. They didn't think she was worthy. She buried her face in Magnus's neck, shame burning hot in her chest. Magnus felt her retreat. He stopped walking in the middle of the tarmac, turning slowly to face his subjects. He didn't speak. He just let his alpha aura flare outward, a wave of dominance so potent it felt like gravity had doubled. The entire front row of warriors dropped to their knees, bowing their heads in submission. It was a silent reminder. Question my choice, And you question me. The drive to the palace was short and silent. The palace itself was a fortress of black stone jutting out of the side of a mountain, imposing and terrifying. Magnus marched her past the bowing servants, up a grand staircase, and into the master wing. He pushed open double doors into a room larger than any house she'd ever seen. A massive fireplace roared. "Stay here," Magnus commanded, setting her down near the fire. "I have to deal with the council. They will want answers about the summit." He looked torn. "Do not leave this room. The palace is a labyrinth, and not everyone is loyal." He kissed her forehead, a brief, searing touch, and then he was gone. The heavy door clicked shut, and the lock turned. Once again she was locked in. But this time the cage was a palace. Morning light in the Steel Kingdom was gray and unforgiving. Elena woke up alone in a bed that could sleep 5 people. The sheets were silk, smelling of sandalwood and Magnus, but the space beside her was cold. She climbed out of bed and approached the massive wardrobe. She gasped when she opened the doors. It was filled. Someone had stocked it overnight. But as she ran her fingers along the fabrics, her heart sank. It was all silk, velvet, cashmere, and lace. Gowns fit for a coronation, lingerie fit for a seductress. There were no jeans, no t-shirts, no simple dresses. After 3 hours, the silence became maddening. She needed food, and she needed to move. She approached the double doors and tried the handle. Unlocked. She pulled it open, only to be blocked by 2 massive guards. "I need to go to the kitchen," Elena said, trying to sound authoritative. "The king has ordered you to remain in the suite, Luna," one guard said firmly. "I'm hungry. I just want to get an apple." "We can send for a tray," frustration bubbled up. "I don't want a tray. I want to walk. I am not a prisoner here." She tried to push past them, but it was like pushing against boulders. "Is there a problem?" The deep voice came from down the hallway. Magnus was striding toward them, flanked by his Beta Garrett. He looked exhausted. The guards snapped to attention. "They won't let me leave," Elena accused, pointing at the guards. "You locked me in a tower like some damsel. I'm tired, Magnus, and I'm hungry, and I hate these clothes." Garrett choked back a cough, clearly surprised that anyone would speak to the Steel Wolf with such tone. Magnus, however, didn't look angry. He looked at her defiant stance, at the fire in her eyes that had replaced the fear. A slow, dark smirk spread across his face. He dismissed the guards with a flick of his wrist. "My apologies, little one," he said, stepping closer. "I forget that wild things do not like cages. Come, if you want the kitchen, I will take you." The kitchen adventure had been a minor disaster involving a terrified chef, but it was nothing compared to the ordeal of dinner. Magnus had insisted on a formal meal. Now seated at a dining table long enough to land a small aircraft on, Elena stared down at a plate of food she couldn't identify. Candles flickered. Servants stood in the shadows like statues, watching. Magnus sat at the head of the table, miles away, dressed in a fresh black suit. Elena poked at the slime on her plate. She was starving, but her throat had closed up. This wasn't her life. She didn't belong here, surrounded by gold leaf and crystal. "Is the food not to your liking?" Magnus's voice echoed down the table. "It's lovely," Elena lied, her voice small. "I'm just not very hungry." Magnus slammed his knife down. The sound echoed like a gunshot. The servants flinched. "Do not lie to me, Elena. You are terrified of the fork. You hate the dress, and you are looking at the door as if calculating escape routes." He stood up, walking down the length of the table until he pulled out the chair next to her and sat down. "Talk to me. What do you want?" Elena looked at him, at the frustration etched in his brow. He was trying, in his own aggressive way. She pushed the plate away. "I want a cheeseburger," she blurted out, "a greasy one with pickles and fries. And I want to eat it with my hands. And I want to take off these shoes because they're pinching my toes." Magnus stared at her for a long second, his face unreadable. Then he threw his head back and laughed. It was a deep, rusty sound as if he hadn't used it in years. It transformed his face, making him look younger. He turned to the head steward. "You heard the Luna. Clear this garbage. Bring us burgers and fries. Lots of them." 20 minutes later, the formal dining room witnessed a historic event. The Steel Wolf and his mate sat side by side, eating greasy burgers off fine china. Elena had kicked her shoes under the table and was dipping fries into ketchup with reckless abandon. Magnus ate with the same grace he did everything else, but he seemed relaxed. He wiped a smudge of ketchup from her chin with his thumb, his touch lingering. "Better?" he asked softly. "Much better," she smiled, feeling the first true spark of connection between them. "Good," he murmured, his eyes dropping to her lips. "Because I need you strong. Tomorrow I show you what it means to be part of this pack." The promise hung in the air, heavy and thrilling. The breaking point came on a cold morning in the 3rd week. An elderly Omega woman named Iris had dared to speak up at the market, suggesting fair distribution of winter stores. A high-born alpha named Henrik had publicly humiliated her, forcing her to kneel in the street and stripping her of her food rations. Word reached Elena while she was in the library. She found Magnus in the throne room, surrounded by his council, and walked straight to the center of the hall. Her hands were shaking, but her voice cut through the assembled wolves like a blade. "An Omega woman was humiliated today for speaking," she said, looking directly at Magnus. "Punished for suggesting we care for our people through the winter. I want justice." The council erupted. "It's tradition," one alpha argued. "Omegas must know their place." "Then tradition is wrong," Elena said, her voice stronger now. She turned to face the council. "If this kingdom's strength is built on cruelty to those who can't fight back, then we're not strong at all. We're cowards." Silence fell like a hammer. Magnus rose from his throne, his presence filling the hall. He looked at Elena, his mate, his queen, standing brave and trembling before wolves who could tear her apart. Pride blazed through him, fierce and hot. "Henrik will be stripped of his rank and exiled," Magnus declared, "and I'm establishing new laws. No wolf may harm another for speaking truth. Omegas are under the crown's protection. Anyone who disagrees can challenge me directly." No one spoke. No one dared. That night, alone in their chambers, Magnus pulled Elena close. "You're teaching me," he said quietly. "That true strength includes mercy. That power without compassion is just tyranny." He pressed his forehead to hers. "You're not just remaking the kingdom, Elena. You're remaking me." 3 days before the combat stretched like years. Magnus trained with fierce intensity. Each night, exhausted from training, he went to Elena's chambers. She never asked about his doubts. She simply held him, pouring strength through their bond, faith and love and absolute certainty that he would prevail. On the night before, Magnus sat before her fire, his head in his hands. "What if I'm not enough?" he whispered. "What if loving you costs me everything?" Elena knelt before him, tilting his face up. "Listen to me. You're not fighting for the old ways or the new ways. You're fighting for us. For this." She placed his hand over her heart, where the bond thrummed golden and strong. "And we are worth fighting for. We are worth everything." Something settled in Magnus then, a certainty that pushed through the doubt like dawn through darkness. The morning of the trial came cold and bright. Thousands gathered at the ancient stone arena. Elena sat in a place of honor, wrapped in furs. Before the combat began, the challenger stood at the arena's center. "Behold your Omega Queen," he called out, gesturing toward Elena, with contempt. "Too weak to stand beside a king." Elena stood. Her legs trembled, but she descended the steps into the arena floor, walking until she stood before him and the assembled thousands. "You measure strength by how hard you strike," she said, her voice ringing across the stone. "I measure it by how many times you rise after being struck down. by how you choose kindness when cruelty would be easier, by how you love when the world tells you you're not worthy of it. She turned, addressing the crowd. And by that measure, I am the strongest person in this arena, because I've been beaten down my entire life, and I'm still standing, because I choose mercy, because I love despite being told I don't deserve it. Silence fell, absolute and profound. Magnus watched his mate, brave and trembling and magnificent, and pride blazed through him like wildfire. The combat began at dawn's first light, and it was intense from the first moment. They circled each other like winter, wolves, their movements precise and powerful. The fight escalated. They moved with incredible speed and strength, each strike calculated and fierce. Elena watched from her seat, her hands gripping the stone. She felt every impact through the bond. She refused to look away. Instead, she poured everything she had through their connection. Faith, love, absolute certainty that he would prevail. The fight continued, minutes bleeding into what felt like hours. Then the challenger overextended, a powerful strike thrown with everything he had left. But the force made him lean too far, left his defenses open for just an instant. Magnus saw it, moved with impossible speed. He was inside the guard before the Alpha could recover, his hand at the throat, forcing him backward and down. They hit the frozen ground with impact that shook the arena. Magnus's position was dominant, his strength undeniable, his victory clear. "Yield!" Magnus commanded, his voice rough with exhaustion, but absolutely unwavering. Slowly, reluctantly, the Alpha bared his throat. "I yield." The arena exploded. Thousands of wolves roared their approval. Magnus stood, swaying slightly, exhausted but victorious. His eyes swept the crowd until they found Elena. She was already running. Magnus caught her, his arms closing around her despite his exhaustion. "I knew," she whispered against his chest. "I never doubted." The formal bonding ceremony took place 7 nights later when the moon hung full and silver above the sacred grove. Every pack in the kingdom came to witness. Thousands gathered around the sacred stones. Elena and Magnus walked into the clearing together, hand in hand. She wore a gown of white silk that seemed to glow. Magnus wore the formal leathers of his ancestors. The pack shaman waited by the fire, an ancient woman named Astrid, whose white eyes saw far beyond the physical world. "Alpha King," she said, "you bring your chosen mate before the pack. But this is not just a bonding. This is prophecy fulfilled." A murmur rippled through the assembled wolves. Astrid raised her arms. Centuries ago it was foretold that when an Omega and Alpha King truly bonded, when love transcended rank and tradition, it would signal a new era. Her white eyes seemed to focus on Elena. She is the chosen one, and this bond will transform everything. Stunned silence fell. Then slowly, wolves began to kneel. The shaman produced ancient ceremonial oils, anointing each of their hands. She pressed their hands together, palm to palm. The moment their palms touched, the bond between them erupted in brilliant gold light, visible to every witness. The thread that connected their souls blazed like captured sunlight, weaving around them. The crowd erupted in howls that shook the ancient trees. Astrid placed a crown of silver on Elena's head, marking her officially as queen. When Elena turned to face her people, she no longer looked down in Omega submission. She stood tall beside Magnus. She had been invisible. Now she was luminous. The prophecy was fulfilled. The kingdom was transformed, and love had conquered tradition. 1 year later. The nursery was the warmest room in the palace, painted in soft creams and filled with the scent of baby powder and lavender. Outside, the winter snow was falling gently, blanketing the Steel Kingdom in silence. Elena walked quietly into the room, smiling at the sight before her. In the large rocking chair by the window, King Magnus was asleep. The massive alpha who made nations tremble was slumped in the chair, his mouth slightly open, looking completely exhausted. And curled up on his broad chest, rising and falling with his deep breaths, was a tiny bundle wrapped in a black blanket. Their son, Prince Caspian. He was only 3 weeks old, but he already had his father's dark hair. Magnus had insisted on taking the night shift, but clearly the baby had won this round. One of Magnus's large hands rested protectively over the infant's back, while the other hung loosely over the armrest. It was a tableau of absolute peace, a stark contrast to the violence that had brought them together. Elena moved closer, her heart swelling. She reached out and gently brushed a lock of hair from Magnus's forehead. He didn't wake, but he stirred, his arm tightening instinctively around the baby. Elena leaned down, her lips brushing against his ear. The memory of that first night in the VIP lounge washed over her. The fear, the recklessness, and the single sentence that had changed everything. She smiled. "You're still the most handsome devil," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Magnus's eyes didn't snap open this time. Instead, a slow, lazy smile spread across his face, his eyes cracking open just a sliver to reveal a glint of molten gold. He didn't lock a door. He didn't roar. He simply shifted the baby closer to his heart, looked at his wife with a love that could burn down the world, and whispered the only word that mattered.